So good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the ITF Transport Outlook session here at the annual summit. My name is Jari Kaupila. I'm a head of statistics and modeling at the ITF, and this is actually our fourth time we're having a specific session, our Outlook, at the summit. And really, I'm just going to very briefly say a couple of words and then leave the floor to our colleague Elizabeth Windisch, who will be moderating the session here. Just on the ITF Transport Outlook itself, this is really our flagship publication, and it's part of the OECD Outlook series together with the Economic Outlook, Environmental Outlook, and so on. What we do in the Outlook, we use in-house transport models that cover all modes of transport, both freight and passenger, and look at long-term development of global transport volumes and related CO2 emissions, health impacts, impacts on infrastructure needs, on access, and so on and so on. This really allows us to analyze how world could change if we choose different policies and different development pathways. The latest Outlook was launched in January this year, in 2017. In the recent version, we had two parts. We look at the global outlook for transport, the transport sector today, first of all, with the short-term projections, and then had the long-term transport demand and CO2 emission projections up to 2050. The second part, we wanted to go much more deeper, look at the sectoral outlook, looking at international freight, international passenger aviation, mobility in cities, but we also looked at access, how those change, what is an impact of future trade on infrastructure needs, and so on and so forth. And we have a very broad statistical annex also in the Outlook. And I welcome you all to download it from our website, www.itf-oecd.org. In this session today, one of the things when we look at the transport, we focus a lot on urban transport, we focus on global transport, but one of the observations we made when we were working on the models and the development of this year's Outlook was that we tend to forget the interurban transport as well, that we don't really look at that. And do we have the policies in place to mitigate the CO2 emissions from interurban transport? What do we do with that? So today we decided, and in this session, we're actually going to focus much more on interurban transport, also look at a little bit more on disruptions, the innovations, both on the freight and passenger side, shared mobility, also interurban freight side, and how those could shape the transportation in the future. This session, like every year, is really feeding into our next edition of Outlook. So we very much ask you to participate, give your feedback, give your comments, your suggestions for what we should be looking at, are we missing something, and we really hope this to be an interactive session at the end of the day. So with that, I will just hand over to my colleague Elizabeth Windisch, and she's going to be moderating the session, introducing the speakers, and how we're going to go forward from here. So again, please welcome and enjoy.
Hello, everyone. First of all, maybe can I ask some people from the back to come here? There are still quite a few seats, so don't be shy and use the seats that are available. So I want to give you a short overview of the speakers that we have today in the session. First, Vincent Benejech, who has coordinated the whole Transport Outlook 2017, will give us a short overview of the highlights that were presented in the Outlook 2017 session. Our second speaker will be Rasmus Valancourt from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He will present some joint work that was carried out together with the ITF that tackles the road transport sector, the road freight transport sector, and how the sector can be decarbonized. Our third speaker will be then our colleague also from the ITF, from the modeling team, Guineng Zheng. He will present some work on interurban transport. It will basically be some sneak preview of the next edition of the Outlook, because it's basically a new model that has been developed in the last few months. Our fourth speaker will then be Pierre Brenda from the French Ministry. He will give an overview of some work that has been carried on long-distance ride-sharing. Overall, the planning is the following. So Vincent will give a very short presentation with around 5-minute presentation with the highlights. Then every other person will have around 15 minutes for the presentation, We will take quick clarifying questions at the end of each presentation, but then open the floor at the end of the session for more questions and a broader discussion. So may I ask Vincent now to come to present the first parts?
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So I would like to introduce some of the main results of the 2017 editions of the Outlook. So the Outlook is about scenarios, so looking into the future. But I think maybe it's very interesting to look at the situation now, because we also spend a lot of time for this Outlook trying to get a good picture of what's happening already in 2015, which is our base year for the Outlook. So how many people are traveling, how much goods are being transported, how much CO2 emissions are being emitted in 2015. And what we observe is that something that we know is that the emission gap, the traveling gap, but also the emission gap maybe is the most striking between developing and developed economies is huge. So going from 0.5 ton of CO2 emissions per capita from transport in non-OECD economies until up to 3 tons of CO2 emissions per capita in OECD economies. So it's six-fold difference. And as the non-OECD economies will develop, this gap will be closing. So both because we have a small improvement in OECD economies, but also because the growth in travel demand in non-OECD economies will not be offset by the efficiency improvements there. So just maybe to give one example, because we will be talking about interurban transport today. So the interurban transport per capita in non-OECD economies will be doubling from something around 1,500 kilometers per capita in 2015 and up to 3,000 in 2015. So maybe looking at the broader picture, what we see is that the transport demand, it will continue to grow. It will be mostly coming from non-OECD economies, as I've just mentioned. So this is the blue part on these graphs. And for passenger transport, we have a doubling, so plus 135% overall, mostly coming, again, from non-OECD economies, but also for international transport, so aviation. And international aviation will be growing very fast in the coming decades. We have an even stronger picture for the freight transport. So it's tripling. So this is driven by international freight, so international trade, pushing forward the demand for international transport, both on the maritime sector, but for other modes as well. And the other modes here, it's mostly road in non-OECD economies, so the blue part again. So of course, we have a lot of uncertainties related to these projections. One of them being the state of the economic environment in the future, and especially of the trade environment for freight sector. So this is something that we tried to look in the Outlook, and you can find already some figures, but it's something that we will try and develop even further in the coming years, trying to understand what could be different scenarios under different trade configuration, especially for the maritime sector. So if we turn these into CO2 emissions, looking at the global picture here, we have 2015 between 7,500 million tons and 8,000 million tons, growing in our baseline scenario to 14,000 million tons. So our baseline scenario is just a continuation of trends from the past, so trying to project a similar pathways for policies, a similar pathways for technological development, and so on. And this leads to almost a doubling of CO2 emissions. So we also tried and look at the low carbon scenario where we actually push all the currently foreseeable policies to their full potential. So trying to understand what is the potential of currently existing or currently foreseeable policies. And here we have a stagnation of CO2 emissions. They slightly reduce, going to around 7.5 gigatons again. So this is this maintains CO2 emissions, but if we really want to achieve the climate ambitions that were drafted in the Paris Agreement, we will need further improvements from the transport sector, and we will need further improvement in the form of innovation, so innovations that tackles this climate challenge, but also radical policy choices. I think I would like to end with some picture from the freight sector, maybe as a brief introduction to our next speaker. So this is our projections for emissions from freight, looking at 2015. 2015, the baseline scenario, where there's a doubling because of this enormous increase in the demand for freight transport, but also in two different scenarios. One, where we only improve efficiency according to assumptions that were drafted with the International Energy Agency, and another one where we further impose optimization in routes and a lot of other organizational changes that my colleague will talk a bit more about. And what we see is that a lot can be achieved from this changes. So this is the second point in my slide here. So we have the emissions per VKM. So this is the technology and the vehicle fuel type. But we also have the VKM, so vehicle kilometers per ton kilometer. So this is the changes in supply chain structures, in routing, in scheduling, and this can achieve quite a lot for the road sector. I would like to end my presentation here, and I will let Elizabeth introduce the next speaker on this subject as well.
And maybe we also have time to take a quick clarifying question already, if there's something on this introduction slide or to the Outlook in general, since Vincent is the best person to talk to here. Okay, not for now, maybe later. So Rasmus Wallenko from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, please. 15 minutes.
Thank you.
I'll show you the sign.
Yeah. Excellent. So thank you for all being here. I'm from the WBCSD, which is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I'm going to talk to you about one of our particular projects called the Road Freight Lab, which is an initiative of our low carbon freight LCTPI. So don't worry, I'll tell you a little bit more what that actually means, other than being unpronounceable. So who is the World Business Council? So the World Business Council is a CEO-led organization working on sustainability. What makes us unique is we work across all the different areas of sustainable development, everything from forestry, social inclusion, to climate change, etc. And we also represent all the sectors. And we have about 200 global blue chip companies that are our members. And what we help these companies do is collaborate on solutions to the sustainable development goals, essentially. And in my part of the organization, which is climate and energy, we are focusing, of course, very much on the Paris Agreement. Importantly, we do work with a lot of the large companies at a global level, very much in a think tank type of mode, but we also have very close links to the regions. We have over 70 global network partners, which are business organizations focused on sustainability like us, but based in national countries. So I do encourage you to also look them up for a lot of the policymakers who are in the room today. So one of the flagship programs we have in WBCSD in the climate energy space is LCTPI. That's the Low Carbon Technology Partnership Initiative. And the idea of the LCTPI when it was launched in COP20 in Lima was really to galvanize the business sector in terms of providing solutions which can meet the climate change challenge in the run-up to COP21 and the Paris Agreement. So the idea being that we wanted to provide certainty and we wanted to provide confidence to the policymakers negotiating the Paris Agreement. So they felt that they had the solutions and the backing of business to be able to take ambitious action. And we had groups that came together across supply chains or value chains, but also specific sectors. And you see them up there on the slide. And what these groups did together was craft a statement of ambition, which really showed what is the full potential in terms of emission reductions that we can get from working in this area. And looking at what are the barriers that are keeping these innovative technologies or even actually off-the-shelf existing technologies and solutions from hitting the market. So in terms of the stage of work, the companies that were working together, we're trying to find what are the barriers and then what are the solutions. And probably most importantly, and this gives you a little bit of a flavor of what the WBCSD does, is that we put together action plans. So of course, you know, as any good organization like ours and many others, we did write a few reports too. But the key thing is how do we get action to happen on the ground? Both individual action in terms of companies committing to doing things within their own fence line or supply chain, but also importantly, the areas where they needed to collaborate. And one of these areas that we wanted to focus on was freight. So you'll see it up there on low carbon freight. Another one very linked to transport is below 50. I encourage you to look up that one as well, looking at sustainable fuels, but I won't be talking about that today. So what are we doing in the low carbon freight LCTPI? So we started out in a process of trying to map the landscape, what's happening out there, and some great initiatives, many of you are representing those here. But one thing we noticed was that there were some solutions that a lot of the forward-thinking companies had deployed or were using, but that weren't really represented in the policy discussions in, for example, the Transport Outlook or anywhere else. And they focused really on two areas. One was around using very sophisticated computer software to do optimization of routing, amongst other things, but scheduling as well. And the other one was there was a few anecdotal evidence of companies working together to use their fleet as one, seeing as they were going to the same customer, for example. And we wanted to pursue these further because we realized that nobody really was working on these. And we wanted to find out what is the true potential, because the literature that was out there didn't actually have much to show for that. So what we did was we worked together with the companies to look at their data in terms of their truck movements, did a literature review as well to find the few papers that were out there. And then we complemented that with some computer modeling to understand, what is the reduction potential really from especially optimization and asset sharing. Along the way, we also bumped into a few other areas which we wanted to look at. One was looking at delivery windows, and just to give us a sense of scale in terms of the potential here, we also looked at alternative fuels and efficiency measures. So these were the early results that we got from our data modeling. And just to put things into perspective, we have there on the far right, some of the, let's say, very well-established greenhouse gas reduction potential areas in terms of alternative fuel and efficiency measures. But we were actually very surprised that on optimization, increasing the size of delivery windows, and also sharing assets between companies, there's a huge untapped potential in terms of reducing emissions. Now, I do appreciate that this is very theoretical. And the whole purpose of what we're doing now is not to do the theory. The theory was there to be able to make the case to actually do this in practice. So what we've moved on to now is actually building this and designing it. So how would it work in practice? And can we reach that emission reduction potential? Because as Vincent says, we desperately need all the solutions that are available. So we started working with the ITF as well during this project, and what was great about working with the ITF was that they have their global models, and they were able to take our data and scale up the results to see what is the full potential at a global level. Is this something worth pursuing both in policy, but also in terms of companies working together to get these solutions to the market? And the answer is clear. It makes a lot of sense. We have two reports. There's a summary version and a long version for the people who want to get the data on all of this data collection and theoretical potential piece that we're done. So one of the reasons we focused on this area was that we realized that the penetration of these types of solutions is very low. And it's only really in large companies that have the resources and the money to spend on this kind of thing. And we all know that in terms of especially trucking, a lot of the freight movement happens with small and medium-sized enterprises. So in terms of our action plan of how to get this to market was to think about how can we make this accessible. And we quite quickly came to an idea of creating a data and asset sharing platform. I want to just run you through the basic idea of what this Road Freight Lab is. Just to be 100% clear, this is probably the hard part, so pay attention now. It's not easy to explain either. So usually, or worst case scenario, a truck goes from A to B, not even full, and then drives back empty. That's worst case scenario. We see lots of examples of that. I heard a great example of between the UK and Poland once, that the same number of trucks and potatoes go between the UK to Poland as from Poland to the UK, and all those trucks go back empty. Not sure if it's true, but I think it's at least partly true. The other one that we've seen, and you've probably heard of lots of startups, things like Uber for freight, etc., is that there's freight exchanges. So what they try to do essentially is that after you've optimized your scheduling and your routing, then you have a couple of problem packages or freight that you need to move. And so you try to find somebody who has some available space, and you try to fill your truck for its empty backhaul. But this happens ex post, not ex ante. So the idea with the Freight Share Lab is really to get under the skin of companies before they do their scheduling, right? So for large companies, building an interface with their ERP systems, and to be able to treat all the fleets that are participating in the platform as if they were one. So you start the whole scheduling and routing process from the first go in terms of having the assumption that you can share assets. And what we're trying to do here is design an open platform. We don't want this to be a proprietary solution. We want to solve climate change. It'd be great if we can make money doing that. But the world's a big place and the market's big, so we'd certainly want other people to try to do the same thing in other places. And we believe that we can add value to the existing freight exchanges that are out there, or individual company offerings, rather than try and create a monopoly over this. So what is the idea here? So right now what we want to do is we want to create a platform that large companies and aggregators like freight exchanges can link up to. But also small companies that can use an app-based solution to be able to access new jobs, new revenue. And in the future, what we expect is that with this wealth of data, we can find new revenue streams as well. Particularly interesting from my point of view is the potential to do traffic flow management. So if you have thousands of companies with their tens of thousands of trucks and vehicles being optimized through the software, if you need to reroute traffic for air quality reasons, for a public event or whatever it might be, you have the ability to do that. So I said that we want to go beyond writing a report, so we've started to design an actual platform, what it would look like. This is the very high level of what it will look like, showing you the integration layers, understanding that there's a static data component, a dynamic data component, as well as possibilities for the small companies to play a key role here. We have just launched today a second report, which goes through the business model, as well as the detailed architecture of this platform. So again, if there's somebody out there who wants to go out and try this on their own, feel free to copy the idea. This is an idea that's worth pursuing. We don't do this, the WBCSD, we're big on sustainable development, but we can't forget that one pillar of sustainable development is the economic pillar. If this doesn't fly in terms of the economic viability, then it won't be sustainable. We've done some numbers to see if this is worth pursuing. And we've looked at two different profits, low and high. In terms of the high profit margin there, that's still comparable or competitive with the current freight exchange transaction fees, so undercutting them. And of course, there's lots more assumptions below this in terms of how many vehicles, how many miles, etc. And you can find all the detail in our report. But this certainly should make business sense. And the big challenge for us now is, can we get from the theory to the practice? And in terms of the practice, you can just imagine that if we're sharing trucks and assets, there's things like we can't put tires and food on the same truck, potentially, right? Or there might be problems with access to loading bays, et cetera, between companies. There's all these practical issues we want to run through in an actual trial that's coming next. So as I said before, have a look at our website. The second report was launched today, and you'll have more details around the numbers, also the architecture, et cetera. And we're actually waiting now in June for a reply back from Innovate UK to see if we would get some public funding to support a demo across the UK, so it would be UK-wide. This is not just about last mile delivery, which a lot of the startups are big on at the moment. This is the whole country. And if that demo goes well, and if we find that we can overcome some of the practical challenges of being able to share these assets, then we will create a new company or spin this off or something like that. So again, I can't stress enough that there are solutions that are out there that haven't necessarily been well documented. They haven't necessarily been included in the analyses of what's possible by countries to reduce their emissions. This is one of them. We think there are probably more out there, and we would certainly want to ensure that the policy landscape that businesses work in is one that enables new innovation to come into play, and new solutions like these. And a last little thing, just in terms of the Innovate UK bid, so we are expecting that to come in June. So if there is anybody from the UK government here listening, then take notes. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasmus. I think now we have 2 minutes or so to discuss first pressing questions, if there is anything you want to direct to Rasmus directly now. Nothing yet. Okay. Then I would ask Guineng Cheng to come. He was going to present you very fresh work, so to say, from the ITF, the model he has been working on over the last couple of months. So yeah, quite exciting new insights.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, everyone. So the main purpose of this presentation is to present the long-term scenarios on the global non-urban passenger transport. What's the demand up to 2050 and the related CO2 emissions are also up to 2050 using ITF's new non-urban passenger transport model. Besides that, we will also explore the perspectives of implementing new interurban modes with different travel speed profiles as well. So our new non-urban passenger module, it covers all the countries in the world, and it consists of 3 main sub-modules. The first one is to generate the non-urban travel demand, which is the passenger kilometers traveled. Is measured by passenger kilometers traveled. So this will be generated as a function of population and income. Next, we will estimate the travel demand by modes by dividing the generated demand into different modes by estimating a mode share model, which is essentially a PKM share model. So the PKM share of each country by different modes will depend on the socioeconomic characteristics of the city, of the country, as well as the transport supply of different modes of the country. It includes road network length, railway network length, number of airports, car ownership of the country, average travel time indicators for different modes, road, railway, bus, aviation, domestic aviation, etc. And then we will convert the travel demand into vehicle travel and eventually into CO2 emissions. So under the baseline scenario, the global domestic non-urban travel demand will nearly triple by 2050. That's what we found in the model. And therefore, by 2030, the travel demand and CO2 emissions, by 2050, the travel demand will triple, and then the CO2 emissions is projected to be double by 2050. And if we compare with the urban sector, the non-urban sector has higher, the green bars shows that it has a higher growth potential than the urban sector. By 2030, basically, the non-urban travel demand and CO2 emissions will start to surpass the urban sector. The reason is that in urban sector, there are a lot of policies which are already in place nowadays. For instance, the transit-oriented development, high fuel tax, and you also have high parking costs and so on. These are policies which are already taking place nowadays in the urban sector. But in the non-urban sector, not so much of such kind of policies are still in place nowadays. So therefore, more attention needs to be paid to the non-urban travel. And if we break down by the travel demand by regions, we can see that the demand growth patterns are pretty different from region to region. Here we selected 4 regions to be as an example. So Africa and Asia here has the highest growth potential. By 2050, the travel demand in these 2 regions will quadruple in the baseline scenario. Whereas in North America and Europe, the travel demand in 2050 increase will more or less around 90% compared to 2015. If we break down by mode, then we can see that demand for all the modes are increasing, except for non-urban car travel demand in North America. So here we're talking about non-urban travel demand, where the stagnation can be seen in the US. But this is consistent actually with what we observed in the US in the past decade. If we look at their historical passenger miles traveled data by modes. And the domestic aviation market is projected to have the highest growth in Asia and in North America as well. Asia and North America, by 2050, if we're summing up the two markets together, this will start dominating the domestic aviation market. So just to highlight this, we are talking about domestic aviation market, making up 86% of the global domestic aviation demand. The main driver for this high growth of domestic aviation demand in Asia is mainly the population growth and the income growth. For North America, because of the geographical distances between the cities are pretty big, and the aviation is much more competitive in most of the city pairs because they're far away. And also because of liberalized domestic market regulations and business model innovations and so on. So this will continue to grow. And just to point out to you that because we're looking at domestic aviation market, that's why we don't see much of these volumes in Europe, because Europe, most of the countries don't have domestic connections between the cities. And if we convert the travel demand to CO2 emissions, we can see that there are also very big differences between regions. So the biggest CO2 growth actually also happen in developing countries, especially in Asia. By 2050, there will be more 1,000 million tons will be emitted in Asia comparing to 2015, actually. So in the developed regions, we can see that although the travel demand is growing, but it doesn't translate into growing CO2 emissions. The main reason behind this is the higher fuel efficiency and the high penetration rates of alternative fueled vehicles comparing to the developing regions. And mode-wise, car will continue to be a dominant contributor globally to CO2 emissions, taking up around 72% globally in 2050 under the baseline scenario. And the question is, facing this doubling CO2 emissions in baseline, how do we reduce the CO2 emissions in this sector? So we designed a low carbon scenario and estimate its impacts. So in the low carbon scenario, we make this assumption of stronger prioritization for sustainable inter-urban transport. So we make assumptions on the lower car ownership growth and the lower expansion rates of road supply. And at the same time, we improve the rail and bus services in terms of the higher coverage, and travel speed will be faster. And just to give you a little example, so in the scenario, we assume a reasonable amount of increase in travel speed in different regions based on their existing conditions. For instance, in the railway travel speed, we assume around from 20 to 30% of travel speed increase in this scenario for Africa and Asia. Whereas for instance, OECD Pacific countries, we only assume around 6 or 7% of the speed increase. In this scenario, we did not explore yet the implementation of new high-speed travel modes in the scenario, but we will discuss this in just a little bit. And we also assume the higher vehicle occupancy rate, taking into consideration that the ride-sharing is becoming more and more popular, both in short and long-term long-distance travels. So regarding this ride-sharing, we will hear much more in detail in our next speaker. And we also made the assumptions on the higher fuel efficiency and higher penetrations of alternative fueled vehicles in this scenario as well, corresponding to International Energy Agency's 2-degree scenario assumptions. So under this low carbon scenario, we found that there are 40% of the baseline car demand could actually be shifted to other modes in 2050. Mode share here, just to highlight again, is measured in terms of PKM share, not the trip share. So in the baseline, we can see that car continues to grow and bus is starting to be replaced by other interurban modes, especially private car. But in the low carbon scenario, we can see that car demand will actually be significantly reduced and replaced by other interurban modes, especially rail, we can see from the graph. And instead of decreasing, because we improve the services and the travel speed of bus as well, so the bus share will remain stable. And in total, using vehicle technology plus the modal shift policy measures, 45% of the baseline CO2 emissions could actually be avoided in 2050. And one of the things that I would like to point out here is that we found nearly 80% of the mitigation of the CO2 mitigation or CO2 reductions actually come from the vehicle technology. Additional 20% of the CO2 reduction potential actually came from modal shift. And shifting from car or airplane to other modes make the interurban travel less carbon intensive. And what about the new high-speed modes? What about Maglev and what about Hyperloops? So here in this section, we will explore the questions. What is the potential of implementing these new modes? And we will take Europe as an example for our preliminary study. So are there any connections in Europe where these high-speed modes are socially beneficial? So to explore this question, we looked at domestic connections between cities with population above 300,000 in Europe. And in the cost-benefit analysis, we considered the fixed cost, maintenance cost, and operation cost as the cost items. And we considered time savings and reduced the negative externality from other modes as benefit items. And we compare with the do-nothing scenario. And the main question we're trying to explore here is, can the demand generated or shifted due to the travel time savings can outweigh the high fixed cost and make the net present value of the project greater than zero or not? So we simulated which are the city pairs in Europe that have positive, negative net present values under different combinations of travel speed and fixed cost. So, for instance, under the assumption, under the network speed of 400 kilometers, with a fixed cost as 25 million euros per kilometer, yes, and then we can see that we could build 2,700 kilometers approximately in Europe. And if we increase the speed to 800 kilometers, the increase in total length will be around 800 kilometers. And the sharp decrease from the graph, we can see that the sharp decreasing trend as the fixed cost increases, and the relative closeness between this blue line and orange line, we can see that the feasibility of implementing such kind of services are much more sensitive to fixed cost than to travel speed reduction. And if we relate these two curves to the current technology, we can consider the orange line to be equivalent to Maglev. For instance, if we make the assumption of assuming using the Shanghai line in China, around 35 million euros per kilometer, then there will be approximately 1,200 kilometers of maglev line that could actually have a benefit to cost ratio higher than 1. And of course, the cost varies a lot depending on the geographical conditions and regions. For instance, the cost of the Japanese maglev line, the Chuo Shinkansen line in Japan, is around 145 million euros per kilometers due to the high number of tunnels and so on. So if we use this fixed cost, like in Japan, then none of the city pairs in Europe would have such high demand to justify the higher cost. And if we consider the blue line to be equivalent to Hyperloop, assuming the initial study found by Elon Musk for the Hyperloop line between LA and San Francisco, so it was approximately 6.5 million per kilometer, then there would be 13,000 kilometers of Hyperloop that have positive NPV values. But later, they also revised their unit cost to be between 47 to 67 million euros per kilometer. Then under such kind of condition, then there will be less than 900 kilometers actually which will have NPV values higher than 0 in Europe. And we also took a look at the high-speed rail services in Europe. On top of what's already been built in Europe, how many extra kilometers of high-speed rail we can actually potentially build. So under the assumption of 20 million euros per kilometer, this is the average figure for high-speed rail, there are potentially 1,000 kilometers additional high-speed rail lines can still be built in Europe. And if we manage to contain the fixed cost to similar level as Paris-Lyon line, which was around 5.5 million euros per kilometer, then the potential of implementing these kind of high-speed services will be much bigger. So just to sum it up, the potential for implementing these kind of high-speed services are highly dependent on the fixed cost. And in Europe, most of the domestic cities are pretty close, and the time savings are not really enough to justify the high cost. So there are many reasons, right? That's existing good rail services, closeness between the cities, and also low population concentrations in the cities, etc. But we would think like Hyperloop or Maglev would actually probably rather be competing with airplanes for international trips rather than for the domestic trips connecting different cities. So therefore, the feasibility of such kind of modes also need to be explored later on for the international connections within Europe, not just the domestic connections. And this we will revise that after or do more on that analysis. But the ultimate feasibility will depend on the ability to contain the fixed cost, how much we could reduce the fixed cost. And also, obviously, depend on the other policies like regional development policies, accessibility policies, etc. And to conclude our study, without additional policy interventions, globally, we will see significant growth in non-urban passenger demand, especially traveling by car, which will lead to doubling the CO2 emissions by 2050. So it's necessary to introduce more stringent policies in this sector. And we also found that out of all the measures, regulating the fuel efficiency standards and adopting the new vehicle technology are the most efficient CO2 mitigation measures we found in the scenario analysis. And it's also very important to improve the intercity rail and bus services because they can effectively change people's travel behavior and reduce the CO2 intensities of the interurban mobility. Thank you very much.
So, are there any pressing questions now concerning this interurban study from the ITF? Yes, please.
I have a question about the sustainable scenario. Did you also include measures taking into account reducing air travel
If I consider what? Air?
Air travel.
Also consider measures that influence the use of air as a transport mode.
Yeah. So in terms of air, we increased we didn't increase the travel speed for air travels, but we make assumptions of increasing assuming the accessibility level will increase. So there's an accessibility indicator inside the scenario design as well.
Yes, but it's more about the production of CO2 in air traffic. What are the possibilities to reduce the CO2 emissions in air traffic?
Yeah, we didn't focus on air, so we just assuming that if the air continues to follow this, and if we have the expansion in terms of airport numbers continue to follow the past trend, and what would be the impact on the modal splits, and then we convert them into CO2 emissions, but we didn't actually design the special scenario only on the air CO2 reductions. Yeah, it's a good point though. Thanks.
Any other question? Maybe I could ask either Guineng or Vincent to give a brief overview of what you expect to be the content of the next Outlook edition. I mean, obviously this interurban model is something that you have developed since the last edition, which will probably be highlighted in the next version. Is there something else you want to focus on for the next edition?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think so in the next Outlook, so we'll have a good focus on interurban, so on this interurban passenger that was just presented by Guineng, and also looking at this innovations for interurban, but also more broadly looking at innovation as disruptive technologies for maybe for a different set of modes and possibilities. So there will be a stronger focus, because for no one we have this baseline scenario and this low carbon scenario that are more or less a continuation of existing trends. So we modify slightly the parameters to have more or less stringent policy applications, but we don't look so much into radical changes in the transport sector. So we have one example here with this very high-speed modes. I think the next presentation about long-distance ride-sharing, so it's also something that we would be happy to look at in more detail. But in the freight sector, we are thinking into looking at other innovation, or other radical changes. So for instance, what would be the impact of 3D printing, or what would be the impact of, can we actually have something like the Internet of Things that some people are talking about? So this is something that we will be looking at in the next edition. And maybe as a side also, another strong focus that we would like to have is on the cost of all these measures. So this is something that we have already started work on. We haven't got far enough to be able to present something, but we're really looking at the cost assumptions of all the scenarios that we are presenting today and all the others.
Okay. You have already mentioned the long-distance ride-sharing, so maybe I can ask now Pierre to present the work the Ministry has been carrying out on this topic.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you all for staying with us this morning. I'm from the French Ministry of Environment, and which is also in charge of transportation in France. Both the line ministries in the same ministry. So I have the chance to present to you here some work that has been done on ride sharing and how it impacts mobility in France. So first, if we take a broad picture and we look a bit over the last decades, we see that although ride-sharing carpooling was already a popular concept in the year 2000s, basically we don't see much in the average car occupancy impact, since on the contrary, the average occupancy rate in French long distance and average travel in France has decreased. So on average from something around 1.8% per car to 1.6. And if we look to long distance travel, from 2.4 to 2.2. But at the same time, if we come to the last few years, there has been a lot of discussion, especially around one company, BlaBlaCar, which is actually the main actor on this market in France of long distance ride-sharing. And even so, the major rail company in France, the rail operator, mentioned as early as 2013 that in their estimates, ride-sharing was already representing at that time 5% of the number of trips sold on their platform, online web platform for train services. So we felt the need to dig in a bit into this situation and to clarify different things, how much of this ride-sharing practice there is actually, and also what is its impact we can foresee in terms of rate of occupancy in the cars and the number of cars on the roads when we construct our projections, which are, for instance, very important for the evaluation of new infrastructures of transport and socio-economic benefits. So the presentation which is done today is actually based on a work by a former colleague, Nicolas Wagner, and I will follow on that. So it's completely based on an approach which is web scraping of data published by BlaBlaCar, because BlaBlaCar actually, by different information and we could get, is by far the main actor on the French market of ride sharing, with share of the market which is way above 90%, with some other actors on long distance ride sharing, but really most of them are concentrating on other potential and historically more looked at, which are short distance ride sharing opportunities. So the method was based on the large sampling over a short period and additional queries to get a correct overview of the evolution over the year. Actually, this platform includes a lot of information already that they share and that you can get directly from it. For instance, you see the number of people who have booked car travel, and for a certain day of because for each travel proposed, you have the traceability of who is proposing a travel and how much people have booked it, and also you have information on the age group and so on. So let's start with some key figures out of this work. I will come a bit later on more precise things, but the number of passengers per year, so the estimate for 2015 was 11 million. So these figures is to be compared. An average trip length of a bit more than 300 kilometers. So this average trip length seems to be pretty stable in French carpooling, because previous studies in 2009 were already getting to similar figures. So that implies that car sharing represents something like 3.5 billion passengers kilometers per year, which represents a market share of around 1.6% of long distance travel in France, but also around 7% of trips by train. So if we come into this market, one striking factor is that actually, although people are completely free to set their own price when they propose a trip on the platform, actually the distribution of price is quite narrow. And I will come to that later, but for instance, the characteristics of the offer actually and the level of supply on the origin destination pairs plays a lesser role than trip distance, for instance. So here are some curves on which you see the probability to find an offer if you come from one origin to a destination. Let's precise that in this study, France was divided into employment areas, which are in numbers of 350 overall. So it means that we looked for travels from one of these from those pairs. What we can observe first is that obviously you have more trip on Friday, Saturday, Sundays than on day of the weeks. So this is the red and violet curve you can see on both graphs, and also other things that I just mentioned is that the probability to find an offer for a given number of travel from place A to place B by car, car, train, and so on is increasing the further the bigger the distance is. So it means basically there are more people likely to propose an opportunity to share their car if there is a long distance. This comes probably to the fact that you are more ready to take the risk of losing, for instance, a quarter of an hour to wait to somebody at the beginning of your trip if you have a very long trip than if you have a shorter one. In terms of if you take fixed distance now, obviously the number of trips, the likeliness to get a trip is increasing when there is more car traffic on the couple origin destination. But still, to give you an idea, on average, so for 2015, you had something like 70% chance to get a service, if you want, of car sharing from point A to point B on a given day. On a given day. So it means that it's always a complement to other modes, but it cannot be the only solution you are looking at. So it's always a complement to, for instance, public transit solutions or owning your car and not using it each time. We'll come back to it quickly after, just to show you also a map of the results. So taking out the shorter trips around the Paris areas on distance of less than 300 kilometers, what you can still see on this kind of pictures is that ride-sharing is still very dominating by some metropoles, so Paris, Lyon, Toulouse, and that most of the trips are done from or to those destinations. Although, for instance, in the western part of France, in Brittany, it's more developed also for smaller origin destination couples. In terms of characteristic of the users, well, without not that much surprise, they are fairly young, although their average is above 30 both for driver and just under for passengers, and getting a bit older than it was in a few years ago. But as you can see, even as a passenger, you still have pretty much passenger up to the age of 60. And it's only for older people that you have really not that much travel by ride sharing. So if we come in terms of purpose of travel, actually from the last inquiry of 2008 on transportation, for all modes and car, we have figures for 2008 here. So you can see that for long distance travel, obviously tourism and visit were already important share for all modes and cars, but for ride sharing, visit is really by way more important, and so ride sharing is for 2/3 used for visit purposes, while for others it's a much smaller share. Another interesting question that was asked during a large survey done by the agency ADEME in France in 2015 was to ask to people that are using this service of ride sharing what they would have done without ride sharing. And just to mention here, so the travel by bus in France has been liberalized over the year 2015, and this new service started only in the second part of the year 2015, while this survey was done in the first half of the year. So that's why you don't see this bus alternative into this graph, but obviously there are strongly competing options. And but still, what you can keep in mind maybe is that 2/2 of the driver would have used their car anyway, but still there are a big share of them that would have taken the train if they wouldn't have had to bear all the cost of the car. While for the passenger, only 16% would have used the car otherwise. If we look into the socio-economic impact of ride sharing, what we can note basically is that because of the figures I've just shown, the impact on the traffic is very limited. So they are basically, if you take into account how much people are taking a car otherwise, basically in this estimate we estimate that it even increased slightly the number of cars on the roads, but it could change if there are more people per car at the end. And what is the benefit is basically if the train services can be adjusted. If it can't, because for instance, as I mentioned before, you don't have always ride sharing, and so it means that if you remove the services for rail, and because on small liaison and so on, you degrade the service, then the overall impact is not that positive. If we come to the long-run ride-sharing potential, 3 opportunities for market share increase have been evaluated. One is a larger diffusion across age group. I will not come into too much detail, but as we have seen in the graph before, actually, if you look at visit purposes, we realize that it's only for the 50 to 64 age group and older ones that there could be some increase in the future if you assume that the share of travel that can be carpooled will be carpooled tomorrow. And another one is that actually it's not that much diffused in space, and there is still some opportunities for small towns for development. So this could be a further increase of 1.2 billion travel kilometers. And finally, according to our projections of increasing the cost of train and car travel, the impact of the price of the other modes should be marginal in the future. And just to come on with my conclusions, so as anticipated and mentioned by big players in the field of train transport, long-distance ride-sharing is already an important mode in France and has developed so over just a few years now, and it's mainly competing with train and more recently coaches alternatives. And there are still some potential for increasing traffic of this mode, which could have a positive socio-economic impact, but without behavioral changes, it should not have a major impact on the total numbers of vehicle kilometers per car, should we look at 2030 or 2050 time horizon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre. I think we can take one question. If there is none, then I would have one. Do you have any insights in the operator's perspective of car sharing? So is this actually an interesting market? Is there only BlaBlaCar in France, or are there competitors coming? So will there even be maybe in the future another price decrease which may make it even more attractive, or do you have any views there?
Well, over there, what we see is that actually for long distance, there is really a benefit to have to be the big player and to have an offer for many situations. So it seems pretty hard to, in our view, to expect a lot of different operators on these sectors, but at the same time, if we look at shorter distance, you have a lot of creativity, a lot of startups that are trying to explore really a variety of concepts to try to get the same type of success in terms of short distance car pooling, because it's not yet, I mean, it's a concept that is suggested for a very long time, that existed also in more traditional way for a long time too, that has reduced over time because people have more cars per household and so on. But with right on time solution where you, and really various economic models, you have a lot of attempts on short distance carpooling, and there could be other big player coming there if one of them really succeed to find something that works at large scale. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So now I would like to open the discussion to broader questions, insights, ideas that any of you may have. And I would like to start with Toru Hasegawa from the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. I think he had some comments, and I also have a microphone here, which may be a bit quicker.
Thank you very much. ICAO also produced the air transport forecast, and then that we are very closely working with ITF. Of course, that both organizations, the method of traffic forecast is a bit different. ICAO's forecast only focus on air transport, but the result is the same. Methodologies are different, but the result is almost similar. According to our forecast published last year, almost the traffic, passenger traffic will become almost double by 2030. Actually, the 4.6% annual growth rate for passengers, and cargo is 4.4%. This is up till 2042. This is my memory. But then that issue here is our forecast that assumes that there is no constraint. According to today's presentation, there's always that so-called modal shift or something like that. We never consider, for example, the intermodal competitions. This is particularly critical for domestic China or domestic Japan or inter-Europe. Already there is a high-speed train impact, the big impact of demand. However, we never consider our traffic forecast. How to customize our traffic forecast is the next challenge. A second is also we never consider the so-called constraint of infrastructure. Even Africa is, we forecasted the lowest growth, so-called growth rate, almost 2% for next 20 years. Nevertheless, Africa, that almost 10 airports are already projected to be saturated in 2020. So how to reflect these types of constraints in our forecast is the next challenge. And then, if we just wanted to add one thing, is everybody if I go to some of the UN meeting, everybody said road first. Road is more important than air transport because of the multiplier effect of road is much, much bigger. So we just try to do which impact is much bigger, aviation first or road first. So this is also underway. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Does anyone have a reaction to that, or also from the panel maybe, or a question to the panel? Yeah, please.
Hello, Paulius Martinkus from Lithuania, Ministry of Transport. I have a question regarding BlaBlaCar. As in Lithuania, we have the issue with the Uber and the issue about taxation and potential evasion of taxation by the drivers, as it is quite difficult to track. Do you face the same problem with the BlaBlaCar? Also about safety, how do you ensure the insurance, technical capacity of the car and all those things? Do the authorities pay attention to that when you talk about BlaBlaCar?
Well, then it's not really BlaBlaCar itself, but so for sharing economy, actually, I mean, if you want to, so the principle, you have a definition, a fiscal definition of what is allowed and what is not allowed. I mean, if, for instance, if you would do travel and basically become a taxi and pay more, want to get more money from the rides and what it costs you, then you would be out of the range. And if you would do too much revenue over the year from that, it would not be okay. But for instance, when we see the kilometer price average we observe on this traffic, it's clearly a share of the cost of the drive, and it's not sufficient for, in most cases, in the distribution for being above what it costs to the driver to make the trip. So it's clearly not a situation like the one we can see in cities where you have a lot of driving which is alternative to standard taxi and which are trying to construct something around the regulation of taxi driving. So, but the main thing is that it was so it's the way fiscality is handled, and you have the right to do things and you don't have the right to do others under these kind of schemes. But it's not directly a check on BlaBlaCar itself, I think, but indirect check on the users that get revenue from it.
Okay, thank you. I fear we have already come to the end of our time of the session, so I will have to close. I wanted to highlight the next upcoming things, and I want to highlight especially two of them: the decarbonizing transport session, which will take place here in 15 minutes. Don't be afraid; there will also be something to eat in here, so you don't have to miss out on the lunch. And at the same time, there will also be the a presentation on big data analysis, also by ICAO, which will take place in the Open Stage Cafe outside. So maybe one of these two is for your interest. Other than that, I thank all the speakers. Thank you for coming, for all your interventions, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you.